Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into the cool, misty waters of a city you've probably never tried to walk through, because you'd sink right through the sidewalk. Imagine an island in the sky, but swap the sky for a shimmering lake, the skyscrapers for temples made of volcanic stone, and the honking traffic for thousands of gently paddling canoes. You're in Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, built smack in the middle of a lake that shouldn't have been habitable, let alone home to a thriving superpower. The year is somewhere around 1500. There are no wheels, no pack animals, no iPhones or even saddles. Just you, barefoot in a linen tunic, squinting at a metropolis that seems to float. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth, with a whiff of something spicy drifting from a nearby cooking fire. You begin by trudging along a thin causeway, just wide enough for a canoe cart or two. Lake Texcoco spreads out on either side of you, the water black in places, shining with sky in others. Waterbirds flicker in the reeds. Behind you, distant mountains still dusted with snow. In front of you, stone towers rising from the lake, pyramids glowing orange in the setting sun, and a dense web of canals stitched between them like watery streets that you've never seen a city like this. The island of Tenochtitlan didn't start big. Back when the Mexica people first arrived here, sometime around the 1300s, they were basically the scrappy underdogs of Mesoamerica. Pushed out of nicer regions by more powerful neighbors, they settled for what everyone else thought was a terrible idea. A marshy, mosquito-infested lake bed surrounded by hostile city-states. Kind of like trying to start a farm on a floating yoga mat. But here's the thing. The Mexica didn't just survive. They innovated. Where others saw useless wetlands, they saw potential. After all, the lake was rich with fish and birds. The soil was squishy but absurdly fertile. And more importantly, it was hard to attack someone who lived on a floating garden. Now, historians still argue whether the Mexica actually invented the chinampa technique or just perfected what earlier civilizations had tinkered with. Some scholars point to similar systems used by the Xochimilca to the south, or even way back by the Toltecs. But nobody denies the Mexica turned it into an art form. And soon, their strange little lake city started to thrive. You finally step off the causeway onto the island. Stone-paved streets branch off in every direction, and people bustle past you wearing feathered cloaks, baskets balanced on their heads. The canals shimmer beside every main road. The buildings are whitewashed, clean, decorated with painted glyphs and hanging flowers. Everything smells faintly of chili, maize, and crushed herbs. Then you catch your first glimpse of a chinampa, and it doesn't look like much from here. It's a narrow, rectangular strip of land, flanked by canal water on either side. There's no raft underneath it. No ropes keeping it in place. In fact, it looks like it's been there forever. Which is exactly the point. Despite the nickname floating gardens, chinampas don't actually float. They're anchored. Built up from the shallow lake bed, these plots are essentially artificial islands, but made with a kind of quiet brilliance that your modern HOA could never approve fast enough. You notice the layout. Each chinampa is about 30 meters long, maybe 2 to 3 meters wide. Willows line the edges, their roots tangled in the mud, holding the whole thing together like natural scaffolding. Crops sprout in neat rows: maize, beans, squash, and a kind of deep purple flower you later learn is amaranth, a superfood that's about 500 years ahead of its trendy comeback. The system is a patchwork quilt of green, gold, and brown, cut through with mirror-flat canals. From above, it would look like a massive checkerboard made of plants. Your guide, an older woman with earth-cracked hands and a twinkle in her eye, waves you into a canoe. She's going to take you through the chinampa zone. You sit down, legs crossed, and she pushes off with a long pole. The boat glides soundlessly. She tells you the lake is shallow here, only about a meter deep in most places. That's why they can build the gardens up by layering lake mud, decaying vegetation, and woven mats made of reeds. It's a little like making lasagna if your lasagna could grow chili peppers. You ask about weeds. She laughs and points to the small army of children hopping barefoot from one plot to the next, plucking weeds, tossing them into baskets, and laughing at you for asking. One boy offers you a bug on a stick. You politely decline. Soon you reach a plot mid-construction. A team of workers, some teenagers, some old enough to be your great-grandparents, are hauling mud in wicker baskets. They stomp through the water with an ease you envy, slapping muck onto mats anchored with stakes. A young man weaves reeds into the edges like a tailor hemming a sleeve. You're told each chinampa takes a few weeks to construct properly. Once the soil is layered and firm, it's left to rest. Then comes the compost, leftover fish parts, ash, even human waste from city latrines. You try not to react too visibly to that last detail. Waste not, want not. The sun dips low as your canoe drifts on. A heron lifts off from a willow branch. Somewhere nearby, a flute plays a tune you don't recognize but somehow feels familiar. This is how a civilization fed itself, not with sprawling farms but with careful geometry, lake sediment, and an uncanny sense of balance between human need and natural flow. And as your guide turns the canoe to head back to shore, you spot something strange. A plot of land entirely covered in marigolds, bright and gold against the green. She explains those aren't for food. They're for the dead. You nod silently. Even the dead, it seems, have a garden here. The next morning, you wake to the sounds of paddles gently slicing water and someone calling out about tamales in a cheerful, sing-song voice. No roosters, no honking, no alarm clocks, just the soft stirrings of a floating city coming to life. You stretch, yawn, and blink at the fog lifting off the lake. Your borrowed sleeping mat is laid out near a small reed hut perched beside a canal. Dew clings to everything. A duck glides by, trailed by a string of ducklings so fluffy they look like drifting corn puffs. Welcome to your first full day in Chinampa country. It quickly becomes clear. This place is beautiful, yes, but it's also a logistical marvel. The Aztecs didn't have endless land to build on, so they made the land come to them. You step barefoot onto one of the narrow plots, the ground cool and damp under your toes, and realize you're standing on centuries of careful planning. Every spadeful of soil, every willow tree, every single basket of muck hauled out of the lake has helped build this not quite floating empire. Your host family, cheerful and already halfway through their chores, waves you over for breakfast. You sit cross-legged beside a small fire and are handed a tortilla fresh off the comal. It's earthy, slightly sweet, and wrapped around scrambled eggs with a generous spoonful of beans. There's no coffee, but someone offers you a cup of atol, a warm maize drink flavored with cinnamon and a mysterious hint of vanilla. You sip it and your sleepiness fades just a little. Then it's time to get to work. Your first job? Shoveling. Lots of it. You're led to the edge of a canal where young men are wading waist-deep in water, using wide, flat tools to scoop up the blackest, richest lake mud you've ever seen. They haul it onto the chinampa with practiced grace, spreading it evenly like frosting on a very large, earthy cake. One of them, grinning, hands you a shovel. You take it, sink into the muck, and immediately realize your modern gym workouts did not prepare you for this. This muck isn't just any mud. It's packed with decomposing plant matter, fish droppings, and centuries of fine volcanic silt. That's what makes the chinampas so productive. The soil never dries out. It drains just enough. And since you can dredge new muck from the canals, the system renews itself almost infinitely. It's like a compost-powered perpetual motion machine. Historians still argue whether the yields were quite as high as some colonial records suggest. Some say the chinampas could produce up to 7 harvests per year, others call that number wishful thinking. But even conservative estimates make it clear. This was one of the most efficient pre-industrial farming systems on Earth. As you work, you begin to notice the geometry of everything. Chinampas are laid out in grids, separated by narrow canals, each about the length of 2 or 3 modern buses. The spacing isn't random. The sun hits them evenly. The water flows just right. Each plot is edged with willow trees, not just to mark the boundary, but because their roots stabilize the soil and prevent erosion. You ask a local boy, no older than 10, how he tells which plot is which. He shrugs and points to the trees. This one has 3 trunks, that one has a hollow knot like an old man's nose. The kids here don't need GPS. They grew up mapping these gardens in their bones. You're shown how to tie a chinampa together. Thin cords made from maguey fiber are used to secure reed mats in place, while long wooden stakes called chapines are driven into the lake bed to anchor the whole structure. It's low-tech, high-skill. And it works. As you haul another basket of sludge, you're momentarily distracted by a duck paddling a little too close to the tomato seedlings. You shoo it away with a polite splash. It gives you a judgmental look and glides off in search of someone less rude. Then you spot something floating in the canal, a strange circular bundle of herbs and sticks. Your host explains it's a kind of natural insect repellent, a little charm they use to keep the mosquitoes down. The trick, she says, is to keep the balance. Too many bugs and your crops suffer. Too few and the frogs go hungry. Speaking of frogs, there's one now, perched on a stone beside your foot, serenading the morning with a high-pitched croak like a squeaky door hinge. You name him Benito. He does not seem impressed. Later, you take a break beneath a willow. Your arms ache, your legs are streaked with mud, and your hair smells faintly of lake water. But you feel oddly satisfied. Like you helped build something ancient. That's when your host points across the canal to another team, older farmers working slowly but with a kind of practiced reverence. They're planting Sempoauxicatl, the marigold used in festivals to honor the dead. You watch them pressing seeds into the soil with care, whispering blessings under their breath. These flowers won't be eaten, but they're just as important. Everything here grows with intention. Even leisure time is purposeful. A group of children splashes in the shallows, racing each other to a marker stone carved with a sun symbol. An elderly woman kneels on a chinampa's edge, embroidering a cloth with delicate maze motifs. The line between work and rest is blurred here. It all feels like part of a single, continuous rhythm. You realize that these people aren't just surviving, they're thriving. With no beasts of burden and no metal tools, they fed an empire using little more than lake mud, woven reeds, and the occasional politely ignored frog. And as the sun climbs higher in the sky, turning the water to shimmering silver, you climb back into the canoe, arms sore, stomach growling, heart full. The chinampas may not float technically, but they do something even better. They hold. You drift downstream now, the paddle tracing soft eddies in the canal, your arms soar in a pleasant way. Ahead, rows of chinampas stretch into the distance like an earthy checkerboard. Your guide, an elderly man with sun-leathered skin and a humming habit, tells you you're headed toward one of the oldest surviving plots in this part of the lake. He refers to it simply as the Grandfather Garden. You squint at the horizon. It looks like all the others. Neatly spaced willow trees, low rows of maize, occasional bundles of squash vines. But as you approach, something shifts. The earth is darker. The air smells richer, like damp leaves and generations of compost. Even the willows seem thicker here, as if they've been listening in on centuries of secrets. Your host beaches the canoe with a practiced nudge. You step out, your sandals sinking into the soft ground. A woman in her 40s greets you, short, wiry, and very amused that your first question is, "Wait, this thing's how old?" She smiles. "More than 500 years," she says, "give or take a conquest." You blink. 5 centuries of uninterrupted gardening on a single chinampa? That's not just impressive, it's borderline magical. But she shrugs as if it's the most natural thing in the world. And here's the first mainstream historical fact of the day. Even the Spanish conquistadors, who burned, toppled, and generally steamrolled their way through the Aztec world, couldn't deny the brilliance of chinampa farming. In fact, colonial records describe how the Spanish tried to keep the system going. Tried being the key word. But we'll get to the collapse later. For now, you're guided to a patch of amaranth, the grain of the gods. You kneel beside your host as she separates the delicate seed heads by hand. They shimmer like clusters of tiny rubies. In Aztec times, amaranth wasn't just food, it was sacred, used in ceremonies and shaped into figurines. Spanish clergy later banned it, calling it heretical. You try to imagine being threatened by a grain and fail. Still, historians debate just how widespread those bans were and whether amaranth truly vanished or simply went underground. One thing's for sure, it's thriving here again. You run your fingers through the soil and feel something coarse. Tiny chips of obsidian. You glance up and your host explains, back in the day, leftover ritual items, including bits of offerings and tools, were sometimes scattered into the garden beds. It's good luck, she says. Fertility for the earth. You nod and pocket a small black flake. You'll probably lose it in your laundry later. A hummingbird zips past your head and hovers near a flowering bean vine. The air seems to pause just for a moment. Then, as quickly as it came, the bird vanishes. You're invited to lunch, an open-air spread laid out under a reed canopy. Everything on the table came from this chinampa. You marvel at the variety. Maize tamales with squash blossom filling, spicy xitomatl salsa made from the earliest strains of tomato, and a smoky mix of nopales, cactus pats, chopped and grilled with lime. You're halfway through your second tamale when your host casually mentions the fireflies. They come out in the evening, she says, just after the frogs settle down. And that's when you realize this isn't just a farm. It's a biome. You glance around and spot dozens of subtle details, bundles of herbs strung over the water to repel insects, logs carefully placed to attract turtles, who eat certain pests, and plants arranged in a way that suggests not just agriculture, but design. Companion planting, microclimates, and maybe even a bit of moon gardening, though historians still argue whether the Aztecs followed lunar cycles religiously or only for ritual crops. You excuse yourself and wander to the edge of the chinampa. Below the surface, schools of fish dart between reeds, and your reflection shimmers like a dream. You remember the term your guide used earlier, chinamiddle. Not just a garden, a weaving, something threaded and alive. And suddenly a sneeze. Not yours, but your host's neighbor, a young man working the adjacent chinampa who's clearly fighting off hay fever. You raise an eyebrow. Allergies existed back then too? Your host laughs. Of course. And we had remedies. She leads you to a small medicinal plot. Bundles of herbs with names that sound like spells. Episode, Tlaupapatla, Quetzalcoatl. Each plant has a use. One soothes the stomach. Another calms fevers. One, she claims, cures heartbreak. You don't ask for a sample. A fringe tidbit here. Some Aztec physicians believed certain plant spirits needed to be appeased before harvesting. They'd whisper apologies or offer bits of cacao before pulling the roots. While modern science may not support that, your guide swears it helps the flavor. The sun begins to dip. Shadows stretch across the canals and everything turns gold. Your host hands you a long-handled rake and nods toward a patch of garlic chives. You rake slowly, letting the scent fill the air. It smells like onions and cut grass and something ancient you can't quite name. Someone plays a flute in the distance. The notes float like dragonflies. You sit back, rake across your lap, and watch the fireflies begin to blink into existence, one by one, like stars testing the waters. The chinampa creaks softly as it settles for the night, and you realize something profound. This place isn't frozen in the past. It's moving, growing, breathing. These floating gardens weren't just invented once. They're reinvented every morning, one handful of lake mud at a time. You lean back against a willow trunk. The flute keeps playing. The frogs begin their nighttime gossip. And under your breath, you whisper a little thank you to the dirt. The next morning, the chinampa is already stirring before you've even rubbed the dreams from your eyes. A soft mist hangs over the water, catching early sunlight in golden strands, while somewhere nearby, a pair of egrets argue politely over fishing territory. You stretch, yawn, and wade through a little breakfast of warm atoll, sweetened maize porridge, and roasted squash seeds. Not exactly continental, but it's deeply comforting. And caffeine-free. You might survive this morning without a coffee, but just barely. Your host gestures for you to follow. We're going to harvest the mud today, she says with a knowing smile. You smile back, mostly because you have no idea what that means yet. You return to the canal edge where two young helpers are already ankle-deep in the water. They're working with long-handled scoops, pulling up thick lakebed muck and piling it onto a flat wooden tray that floats on a reed mat. You're handed a smaller version, and with some gentle encouragement, playful heckling, you wade in too. The mud is cold, silky, and utterly alive. It smells like earth, algae, and wet leaves, and something else you can't place. The texture is oddly satisfying, like pudding that's seen things. Here's your mainstream historical fact of the day. The Aztecs used this lake mud, along with decaying vegetation and human waste, to form the base layers of their chinampas. It was a masterclass in nutrient cycling long before anyone called it sustainable. They didn't just grow crops. They fed the earth that fed them in a feedback loop of uncanny elegance. You haul up a scoop and slap it onto a reed raft. The mud clings like chocolate frosting, and you try not to think about how many eels just swam past your feet. But there's a reason this mess is so important. The lakes of the Valley of Mexico weren't all the same. Lake Texcoco was brackish and shallow, but nearby freshwater lakes, like Xochimilco and Chalco, were fed by mountain springs and perfect for chinampa farming. That delicate balance of water types created a sort of natural laboratory. And the Aztecs? They were the scientists in rubber boots. Well, metaphorically. They mostly went barefoot. Your host points out how this harvested mud will be mixed with other materials, pulverized maize husks, ashes from cooking fires, even old textiles, to aerate and enrich the new soil. Each layer is hand-placed on top of the chinampa with patient rhythm. Mud, mulch, mud, mulch. It's like making a massive aquatic lasagna. Historians still argue whether this technique was entirely original to the Aztecs or inherited from earlier cultures like the Xochimilca, who first settled the southern lakes. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Empires, after all, are like chinampas, built on layers of what came before. You pause to rest beneath a willow whose trunk bends dramatically over the water like a bow. Your host hands you a cup of chilled agua de chia, filled with floating basil seeds that squirm slightly in the sun like tapioca pearls. It's delicious, slightly weird, and probably hydrating. You sip slowly, letting the coolness pull you out of the mid-morning haze. A low whistle pulls your attention toward the main path. Another elder approaches, this one wearing a wide straw hat and balancing a wooden frame over one shoulder. It's a tlachicero, a sap gatherer, though in this case he's here to collect the sap not from agave, but from a rare sweet reed grown at the water's edge. Fringe tidbit incoming. Some chinampas included micro-patches of rare plants not for eating, but for trade, ritual use, or just pure flexing. Think of it like ancient hobby gardening. But your bonsai is worth 3 cacao beans and a gourd of fermented maguey juice that you're given the chance to plant something yourself. A single tomato sprout, carefully guided into a shallow groove and pressed in with a thumb. The guide shows you how to pack the mud around its base, but softly, like tucking in a baby bird. You resist the urge to name it. You glance across the chinampas and see a young girl balancing an enormous clay pot on her head. She's probably 8, maybe 9, and somehow looks more stable than you do on flat land. She's carrying water, clean spring water from a nearby canal, part of the daily irrigation ritual that's been practiced here for generations. Watering isn't just a chore, it's an art. You watch as she tilts the pot just slightly, letting the water dribble out like a gentle rain. Not too much, never too much. Flood the roots, your host warns, and they drown. Starve them and they sulk. Honestly, you know a few people like that. Another visitor arrives on a small wooden canoe, this one bringing duck eggs and dried chiles to trade. You've just witnessed a simple but profound fact. These chinampas weren't just farms. They were community hubs, commerce nodes, and miniature worlds. Their narrow footpaths and canals were arteries of a living city, pulsing with people, ideas, and yes, even gossip. Someone jokes that a chinampa's productivity depended on the number of chisme rumors shared on its soil. That's probably not true, but you smile anyway. By late afternoon, your muscles are sore, your feet are wrinkled, and your hands are stained with something you hope is just algae. But your tomato is planted. Your mud is piled. Your contribution is modest. Still, the local kids give you an approving nod. You try not to cry. Back at the main hut, dinner is already bubbling. A simple stew of beans, squash, and smoked fish simmers in a clay pot. You sit beside it, warming your hands as fireflies return in little flickers. The frogs are louder tonight, clearly debating politics. Your host notices your glazed expression and chuckles. Tomorrow, she says, you help with the ducks. You nod, a little dazed. Do I have a choice? Of course not, she says, grinning, and just like that, another day folds itself into the rhythm of the chinampa. Layer by layer. Mud and laughter. Water and fire. Plant and person. The ducks arrive with sunrise. Or perhaps the ducks are the sunrise. There are so many of them and they are so loud that the very idea of sleeping past dawn feels like a childish fantasy. You try to cover your ears with a reed mat, but no luck. This morning belongs to the birds. You shuffle out of the hut, hair a disaster, dreams forgotten. The air is cool and wet, and the canal mist drifts like low-hanging laundry between the chinampas. From somewhere behind you, a voice calls, "Appurate." The ducks are waiting. You follow a trail of feathers toward a narrow wooden dock, where 2 children are herding the birds, attempting to, with long sticks and a pouch of ground amaranth seeds. It's organized chaos. The ducks paddle, honk, dive, and occasionally turn in full circles for no discernible reason. One tries to eat your sandal. You try not to take it personally. Now here's today's mainstream historical fact. Aztecs kept ducks, turkeys, guajolotes, and even dogs, specifically the hairless zooloid squintly, as sources of protein. But on chinampas, ducks were more than just food. They were pest control, fertilizer generators, and part of the living ecology of the floating gardens. Their droppings enriched the soil, their waddling stirred up bugs, and their eggs were an easy source of protein for breakfast. You scoop a handful of the feed mixture and scatter it across the water. A frenzy erupts. Wings slap the surface. Quacks ricochet off the trees. You catch a glimpse of a heron watching the drama with a withering expression, like someone who ordered the tasting menu but got chicken nuggets instead. Your host approaches carrying a woven duck basket, which you now know is not for decoration. It's time to move a few particularly sassy ducks to the next chinampa, one that's recently been planted and needs fertilization. You're handed the basket. The duck eyes you. You eye the duck. Let's just say, you both lose a bit of dignity in the next 3 minutes. After the relocation mission is complete, you're taken to a shaded patch where fish traps are being cleaned. These are simple devices, woven cylinders baited with crushed insects or maize flour, and they catch small tilapia and mudfish, both of which are smoked or stewed. The traps are clever, reusable, and, bonus, they occasionally snare water snakes, which are either released or turned into surprisingly popular snacks. You opt not to ask which outcome you're currently eating. Fringe tidbit. Chinampa farmers sometimes introduced aquatic plants like duckweed and water hyacinths not for beauty, but to control mosquito populations and oxygenate the water. One farmer even claims they had a chinampa where dragonflies were encouraged on purpose, the original biosecurity patrol. After a quick snack of roasted corn and a cacao-based drink, Less sweet than you'd hoped, but very grounding, you are shown another critical chinampa feature: the living fence. These are rows of ahujote willows whose knobby roots bind the chinampa edges and whose leaves offer shade, firewood, and protection against erosion. Why not stone, you ask? Stone sinks, your host replies, smirking. Fair as you weave between the tree rows, you pass tiny shrines, mud altars dotted with clay figures and dried flowers. Offerings to Tlaloc, the rain god, or to Chicamcotl, the maize goddess. Sometimes both. A toothy mask stares up from the base of one shrine, its paint faded and its tongue forever lolling. Historians still debate how many of these practices were communal versus household rituals. Some claim every chinampa had its own spirit guardian. Others argue the shrines were symbolic gestures to please the gods of agriculture and water, not literal neighbors. Either way, the result is the same: a sacred respect for the cycles of planting and harvest, and a fierce pride in the craft. And make no mistake, this was a craft. Not just anyone could build or maintain a chinampa. There were specialists: dredgers, planters, willow weavers, canal cleaners, and fish watchers. Each had a role, and stepping outside your lane was discouraged. Unless, of course, your excuse was, "The ducks made me do it," in which case most elders would just nod knowingly. As afternoon arrives, you're invited to join the canal patrol. This isn't quite as glamorous as it sounds. It mostly involves paddling through the narrow waterways and checking for blockages, bank erosion, or mischievous children throwing rocks at ducks. You spot 3. They waved at your hand at a paddle carved from obsidian wood, and you do your best to mimic the slow, steady rhythm of your guide. The canoe glides smoothly, the water almost mirror-like. Dragonflies dance around the prow. A turtle blinks at you, then disappears under a lily pad like a small, wet magician. This is where you see it, the larger network. Chinampas aren't just scattered plots, they're linked. Canal by canal. Tree by tree. A vast quilt of floating life stitched together by mud, plants, people, and tradition. From a distance it would look like a mosaic. Up close, it feels like a heartbeat. Your guide tells you that during market days these canals became bustling highways. Canoes loaded with maize, flowers, chili peppers, and even songbirds glided toward the city center of Tenochtitlan. Picture a traffic jam, but with more herons and fewer horns. As the sun tilts lower, casting everything in amber light, you pull your canoe alongside a floating garden where 2 old women are laughing so hard they nearly drop their squash bundles. You catch only part of the joke, something about a priest, a frog, and a very confused goose, but it's enough to make you chuckle too. Later, back at your home base, you rinse your feet, change into dry cotton wraps, and accept a warm bowl of tamales from someone who clearly knows you had a day. The steam rises, fragrant with epazote and chili. You eat slowly, mind calm, body heavy. Tonight, the ducks are quieter. The stars are brighter. The canal whispers instead of claps. And as you settle into your reed mat and close your eyes, one last thought floats through your mind. You came here to see a floating garden. But what you've really found is a floating world. You're up before the sun this time, barefoot, blinking, and just barely functional, but it's worth it. The chinampas at dawn are something else. Fog wraps the gardens in a soft hush, and every leaf seems outlined in silver. The willows droop like old monks, and the canal surface is still as obsidian. A canoe glides past without a sound, the paddler cloaked in wool and patience. Today is compost day. You're not thrilled. Nobody loves compost day. But if you want floating gardens that grow 5 crops a year, you need more than sunshine and duck poop. You need a well-orchestrated ballet of decay. Mainstream historical fact: the Aztecs were masters of organic fertilization. Alongside waterfowl droppings, they layered decomposed lake mud, limo, plant refuse, kitchen scraps, and even human waste into the chinampa beds. Not directly into the root zones, of course. That would be, well, a bit too personal, but used strategically to recharge the land between plantings. You follow a team of gardeners down a narrow path, carrying woven baskets full of what might generously be called nature's leftovers. Bits of maize husk, spoiled squash, feathers, fish bones, pulpy fruit rinds, shredded maguey fibers. The smell is vivid. Not terrible, but definitely character building. Your guide grins as he lifts a lid off a compost pit and stirs the contents with a carved paddle. A puff of steam escapes, carrying notes of damp wood, chilies, and something that smells suspiciously like yesterday's tamales left in the rain. He says something about feeding the earth's belly, and you nod solemnly, mostly because your mouth is busy not breathing. Next comes mud dredging. The canals, as it turns out, aren't just pretty scenery, they're the lifeblood of the gardens. But over time, sediment settles. So, workers use long-handled scoops to pull up thick, nutrient-rich muck from the canal bottom and slap it onto the chinampa beds. This stuff is black, sticky, and heavier than betrayal. Fringe tidbit: some chinamperos claimed that dredged canal mud had magical properties. It remembered the crops it had nourished and helped the next generation grow better. This belief gave rise to specific mud rituals, like burying small obsidian shards in the soil before planting chili seeds, to heat the harvest. You give dredging a try. It's a full-body workout and more splashy than you'd hoped. One scoop lands directly on your foot. A nearby boy snickers and mimes slipping into the canal. You do not find this helpful. Still, there's a rhythm to it. Scoop, lift, swing, slap. Over and over. The sun rises, ducks flap past like winged bananas, and dragonflies sparkle in the mist. You feel a bit like you're in a slow-motion montage of an ancient training sequence. Compost Warrior 4, Mud Reckoning. Once the beds are freshly layered, the planting begins again. This is where things get surprisingly delicate. Seeds aren't just tossed into the soil. They're whispered to, lined up like soldiers, spaced according to the moon's mood. Okay, maybe not exactly that, but close. Aztec agriculture had a strong spiritual component. Certain crops were associated with specific gods, directions, and times of year. Maize, for example, was linked to the east and the goddess Chicamcotl. Beans had their own guardian. So did amaranth, squash, and chili. Historians still argue whether these spiritual guidelines were strictly religious or served practical purposes as well, like rotating crops to prevent soil exhaustion. Either way, the ritual felt grounding. You press seeds into the warm earth, cover them gently, and mark the row with a reed. Then comes the part that really surprises you. Singing. The old woman beside you, her back is bent as a sickle, hums a tune as she plants. It's low, repetitive, not quite melodic, but oddly beautiful. It's not for entertainment, she explains. It's for the plants. They like to know who's feeding them, she says. Otherwise they get nervous. You hum too. Your tune is probably more out-of-key frog than ancient lullaby, but the effort earns you a nod. Later, as the new rows settle under the sun, you're shown one of the most ingenious tools in the chinampa arsenal, the COA. It's a digging stick, not fancy, just a wooden shaft with a flared end, sharpened and fire-hardened, but in the right hands it's a wand. With it, planters can loosen earth, draw furrows, and aerate the soil in seconds. You practice for a while and only jab yourself once. Progress. Then comes the inspection. A pair of older men arrive by canoe, wearing cloaks of woven grass and grim expressions. They are officials, keepers of canal law if you will. Their job is to make sure each chinampa follows community guidelines. No unapproved structures. No overharvesting. No blocking shared waterways. No duck overpopulation. Yes, that's a real concern. Ducks breed like wild ducks. You watch from a respectful distance as they examine rows, prod the willows, and measure water depth with a carved stick. At one point, they pause to admire your planting rows. You try not to beam. Fringe law alert. Chinampas were technically communal land, though families maintained them like private plots. However, breaking rules, like fencing off public canals, could result in penalties. Not jail usually, but fines, labor duties, or worst of all, a visit from the priest of Tlaloc, the storm spirits. That usually involved cold water and dramatic speeches. After they leave, the farmers let out a collective breath. You hadn't realized how tense everyone had been. Even in paradise, bureaucracy finds a way. As the sun peaks overhead, you share a meal beneath a willow tree. Fresh tortillas, roasted squash, beans, and something described as lake cheese. It's better than it sounds. Tangy, smoky, and oddly satisfying. You lean back against the trunk, hands covered in dirt, stomach full, and eyes half closed. You've spent the morning composting, dredging, planting, and singing to corn. You are somehow entirely at peace. A boy walks past, holding a snake by the tail. It was in the water, he says. You decide not to ask what happens next. Back at your floating garden, you slide your canoe into its little carved-out berth along the chinampa's edge. The water laps gently, a quiet applause for a day well spent. You unload your haul, crates of squash, bundles of herbs, the slightly suspicious pouch of miracle amaranth seeds, and the new COA, and begin sorting everything into its place. That you've got a rhythm now. There's comfort in the repetition. The same tools, the same pathways between chinampas, the same duck that insists on inspecting your sandals every evening as if you're smuggling corn past customs. Tonight, though, you don't go straight to dinner. You walk along the narrow paths connecting your garden plots, the ones just wide enough for your feet but still soft from the week's rains. You're headed toward the east field, the one with the newest rows of maize, because tomorrow, something special happens. That it's the spring festival in honor of Xilanen, goddess of young maize. And she's a bit of a diva, truth be told. Demands songs, flowers, dancing, and offerings. Your job? Make sure your chinampa is properly prepped to host the celebration. Mainstream historical fact: the Aztecs had over 100 festivals per year, some grand, others small and local, tied closely to agricultural cycles and the gods' appetites. Offerings for Xilanen often included ears of young corn, garlands of marigold, and incense burned until the air itself seemed to shimmer with spice. You begin weaving fresh garlands from wildflowers that grow near the canal, bright yellows, deep reds, the occasional indigo bloom that stains your fingertips. They smell like earth and sun and something slightly bitter, like thyme. Quirky tidbit: in certain districts, young women competing in Xilanen festivals would enter a sort of corn queen pageant, judged not just on beauty, but on their skill at weaving flower crowns and preparing symbolic maize dishes. Winning meant honor, and a slightly terrifying amount of responsibility, including staying perfectly composed while wearing ceremonial garments made of actual sprouted corn husks. You drape the garlands across your canoe, your plots, and even that one particularly uncooperative tree whose roots keep trying to undo your neat canal wall. You sing softly while you work. Nothing fancy, just one of the lullabies your grandmother taught you. It's meant to encourage crops to grow straight and tall. Also meant to discourage mole crickets, but they don't seem to listen. The sun dips lower, gold bleeding into amber across the lake's surface. You take a moment to sit on the edge of your chinampa and let your feet dangle in the water. The tiny fish tickling your toes probably think they're nipping at tree roots. You don't correct them. Historians still argue whether Aztec agricultural festivals were more religious observances or practical motivators. Some suggest the rites functioned as social glue, an excuse to coordinate planting cycles and strengthen community bonds. Others insist the ceremonies were literal negotiations with the divine: offer corn now or risk famine later. Both views have their merits, and perhaps both are true. You light a small brazier using dry oak wood and a twist of copal resin. The smoke that rises smells like pine and something ancient. You wave the scent toward the field, toward the sky, toward your own tired hands. Your neighbors do the same from their nearby chinampas. For a few minutes, everyone stops talking. You all just watch the smoke. A chorus of frogs resumes as the last light fades, and you stand to finish your preparations. The night breeze rustles the corn stalks, and in the darkness, they sound almost like whispering people, hundreds of them brushing past one another in a crowd of silk robes and seed pouches. Tomorrow there will be music and dancing and generous toasts of pulque. But for now, it's just you and the maize and the gods. You retreat to your home hut and place your new COA near the doorway, its etched handle glinting slightly in the firelight. You'll need it at dawn, right after the festival, when the real planting begins. You prepare a simple dinner: bean stew thickened with ground squash seeds and tortillas warmed directly on the hearthstone. There's a tamale wrapped in totomoxtle leaf saved from the market, filled with chili and smoked mushrooms. You take one bite and let your whole body sigh. You eat slowly, cross-legged, surrounded by the quiet hum of frogs and insects. Somewhere in the distance, a flute plays, the kind with a sound like wind whistling through a bone. You still haven't decided whether it's haunting or just out of tune. As you drift into sleep, you hear water lapping against the edges of your floating world, soft and persistent. Like a cradle or a whispered secret you were never meant to forget. Tomorrow you'll honor the gods of maize. And tomorrow they may or may not honor you back. But tonight the corn listens. You wake before the sun, eyelids sticky with sleep, body stiff from the mat. The familiar weight of another day settles onto your shoulders like a cloak woven from reeds and dew. You stretch, creaking slightly like an old canoe, and step outside. The sky is a dull slate, not yet painted with sunrise. The air tastes of ash and moisture. Somewhere, a waterbird makes a lazy, throaty call, either a greeting or a complaint. Hard to tell before coffee. Except, of course, there is no coffee. This is the Aztec basin, not a sleepy Paris cafe. Instead, you chew a bit of cacao paste, bitter and dense, enough to wake up your tongue and maybe your spirit. You rinse your face in the canal. The water's cold enough to jolt even the maize gods awake. Today is planting day. You grab your new COA and walk the length of the chinampa. The soil is damp, crumbly, exactly the way it should be after weeks of composting and careful watering. You pause to admire your handiwork, not out of pride necessarily, but out of relief. This chinampa is ready. Mainstream historical fact: the planting process on chinampas was highly systematic. Farmers used dibble sticks and koas to poke uniform holes in neat rows. Into each went a seed: maize, beans, squash. These three crops grew together in perfect synergy. The maize climbed high, the beans wrapped around it for support, and the squash shaded the soil below. Quirky tidbit: the Aztecs believed that planting with the wrong hand or at the wrong time of day could insult the maize spirit. Some farmers even whispered apologies to each seed before covering it, just in case they'd been too rough with the soil. Superstition? Maybe. But you catch yourself muttering a polite tlazocamity, thank you. Anyway, you begin with the maize. The new COA slices easily into the soil. You drop the seeds in, one by one, like placing tiny promises into the earth. A few chinampas away, you hear other farmers doing the same, punctuated by occasional sneezes from the floating pollen or someone losing their sandal in the muck. The sun slowly cracks over the mountains, spilling gold across the lake. Mist rises like steam from a giant's bath. You keep planting, moving methodically from one row to the next, arms swinging in a steady rhythm. You finish the maize, then begin the beans, careful to nestle them beside each stalk. Then the squash, spaced just wide enough to stretch its broad leaves over the soil. You pause mid-row to sip from your water skin and mop sweat from your forehead. Your neighbor calls out a joke about how your beans look shy, too small for marriage. You fire back something about his squash having commitment issues. He laughs, and the sound carries across the canal like birdsong. Planting day may be sacred, but that doesn't mean it's solemn. Historians still argue whether the three sisters method, maize, beans, and squash planted together, originated in Mesoamerica or if it was developed independently in different regions. What's clear is that the combination became one of the most sustainable and nutritionally balanced farming systems in pre-modern history. It was genius, disguised as gardening. By midday, the last row is done. You sink to the edge of the plot, legs dangling into the water, and let your hands rest on your thighs, palms open to the sky. Around you, the chinampa floats quietly, already changed. It looks the same, rows of soil, silent water, but beneath the surface, life is beginning. Seeds swell. Roots stretch. The lake waits, patient. You eat a quick lunch of tortilla wrapped around roasted chayote and salted pumpkin seeds, then lie back among the reeds and stare at the drifting clouds. They look like jaguars today. Or maybe just tired sheep. That afternoon, a group of elders paddles down the canal, singing softly. They're headed to the central causeway to make an offering of tamales and incense. One of them tosses a garland of flowers onto your chinampa as they pass. A silent blessing. You nod back, trying to look reverent and not like you've just woken from a nap with your cheek stuck to a squash leaf. By evening, the lake has turned silver. The chinampa smells of wet soil, crushed flowers, and something ancient, like the inside of a clay pot that remembers every stew it ever held. You light a final bit of incense and tuck your tools away. The COA rests beside the doorway, its blade flecked with earth. Your arms ache, your legs throb, but it's the good kind of tired, the kind you earn. Back inside, you lay down and let your eyes fall shut, your mind drifting not into sleep just yet, but into that fuzzy realm of floating thoughts and half-memories. You think of maize gods and floating gardens, of morning mists and three quiet seeds nestled deep in the soil. You think of the lake, breathing slowly around you, rising and falling like a great sleeping beast. The world tilts softly into silence. Now the garden fades, the chinampa dimming like a boat drifting into fog. You're still there, but you no longer need to do anything. No more planting, no more tools, just the gentle pull of water and sleep. Let the breeze wrap around you like a cotton blanket. Hear the soft ripple of waves nudging against the roots. Even the frogs have quieted, their songs now slow and drowsy. The stars overhead begin to blink into view, like old friends arriving one by one to keep you company. You breathe out, long and slow. The lake mirrors your breath. In and out. The soil you worked, the seeds you placed, the rhythms you followed, they're all doing their quiet work now below the surface without you. Everything continues without effort. You've done enough that there's a hush to this moment, a stillness that wraps around the floating garden like mist. The kind of hush that doesn't ask questions or make plans. It simply holds you. If thoughts rise, let them drift. Let them float like petals across the canal, carried away without resistance. Your body rests on the chinampa, and the chinampa rests on the water, and the water rests on the world. You are cradled, you are buoyed, and you are deeply, deeply safe. So close your eyes now if you haven't already. Let the lake carry you, let the maize grow, and sleep. Sweet dreams.